I like to move around, but I don't have a clicker, so I'll be around here. Okay, so briefly, give me a few words. What comes to mind when you think about domestic servitude? Just a few words.
Control.
Control, okay.
Isolation.
Isolation.
Nanny.
I'm sorry?
Nannies.
Okay, yeah, nannies. No, that's very true. Anything else?
Degradation.
Degradation. Okay. What's particular, and I liked when you mentioned nannies, what's particular to domestic servitude that makes it different from other types of trafficking that we think of usually?
It's kind of hidden.
Kind of hidden, okay.
Upper class affluent.
Okay, very good. Anything else? In the home. Okay. So before we jump in and look at domestic trafficking, I'm going to domestic servitude. I'm sorry. I'm going to get a little bit into some of the statistics that we know, and we're going to actually do a case study together to see exactly what it looks like. We got to start with from the beginning, the human trafficking statute. So our human trafficking statute, our federal statute, passed in October 2000. We have a Florida statute which passed in 2004 and mirrors actually our state statute. So we're going to look at the TVPA of 2000 first. A lot of times we talk about sex trafficking and we don't focus as much as on labor trafficking. But as you'll see with some of the statistics, labor trafficking is just as prevalent as sex trafficking. The statute itself, not to get too much into the individual points, but what's very important about it is a couple of things. Number one, we had laws in our books or in Constitution that abolished slavery in the United States. Our 13th Amendment abolished slavery. However, we started seeing that because of globalization, what we knew as traditional slavery was no longer the case. So what happened is we passed our human trafficking statute, and one of the things that's very important about it is that it includes the psychological restriction of movement. When we think about slavery in the past, usually we think about someone being bound, tied, shackled, that they're physically restricted from leaving the situation. So there's that labor component that we still see in traditional human trafficking and we saw in slavery. But what we're seeing is that a lot of times, victims are allowed to walk freely in our communities. And that's one of the things when I started working in this field around 2005, that when we were doing assessments, whether it was law enforcement or service providers, one of the things that we would get stuck on would be, but they were allowed to go to church, but they were allowed to walk the streets, but they were allowed to, so that movement. But one of the things that the law takes into consideration is that a lot of times victims are threatened, that their families are threatened, and so that they don't leave the situation even though they can freely walk out because of that psychological fear. And that's one of the things that's very important about our new statute. Now, it's divided into two parts, sex trafficking and then everything else, so labor trafficking. The reason that it is split is because with sex trafficking, so basically both of them look at labor, and they talk about the three key words that we always look for, that there was force, fraud, or coercion. However, in regards to sex trafficking, if it's a minor, you don't need to prove that they were forced, tricked, or coerced into the act. So that means if there's an adult who's forced into commercial sex, you will look for the force, the fraud, and the coercion. If it's a minor, you won't. So if you find a child who's involved in prostitution, which is commercial sex, it's automatic. You don't need to look at that when you do your interviews, when you speak with the person. The reason that it's split is because with labor trafficking, for minors as well, you do have to look at the force, fraud, or coercion. So when you're interviewing a minor, as well as an adult in labor trafficking, you do need to look at these three things. So when you are looking at domestic servitude, let's say of a young child, you will need to find out, you will need to look how they were forced into working in a home, into cleaning, into so forth. It's not going to be automatically, just because a child is cleaning, is cooking, it's not going to be automatically trafficking. So that's the reason that it's going to be split. And that's applicable to minors working in the field, minors working in any form of the potential labor trafficking situation. Any questions on this? Okay.
What is peonage?
Peonage, debt bondage, and involuntary servitude are more or less similar, in which somebody has a debt and will work off the debt. Sometimes you find situations in which it's the family is already involved, and then the child automatically will be involved in working and so forth. But they're more or less the same scenario. So when does it become domestic servitude? I mean, yes, does it become trafficking? So you have someone who's a housekeeper, who's a nanny, who's an au pair. When does it become trafficking? So according to the Polaris Project, which is a great organization, I encourage you to look at their website. They run the National Human Trafficking Resource Center and Hotline, and they have a lot of information on different types of trafficking. They have this statement: victims of domestic servitude work about 10 to 16 hours a day for little to no pay. Very important about the little to no pay piece. A lot of times we think victims of trafficking are not paid at all. In some instances they are. You'll find a lot of times that victims are given money so they could wire money back home to their home countries. So that makes the family members think, well, if they're sending me money, everything must be fine, right? Because they're able to send something back. And so you do have situations which victims are paid. It becomes trafficking when there's force, fraud, or coercion to maintain control, and to cause the worker to believe he has no choice but to continue to work. So a lot of times when I have done screenings, one of the questions I ask the victim is, if I found you a job, could you leave the situation? You might find those who tell you, well, yeah, I mean, I stayed here because I didn't know where else to look, or I didn't know there were other jobs available. So there you might have to look at the fact that it might be just some labor exploitation, which is still serious, but it's a different form of, it's a different type of situation. That's something maybe the Department of Labor can assist with, wages, and that department has been great in providing guidance in that. But if you ask them, if I found you another job, would you be able to leave? And they tell you, well, no. They know my family. They don't allow me to leave the house. How would I leave? They have my documents. Then you know that there's something more to it than just the fact that, you know, it's a job that they are not getting paid, or are being, there might be an abusive or exploitative situation. So briefly looking statistics, and I think that it was mentioned earlier when Governor Scott was speaking, and I saw it also in the book that was provided to all of us, about the fact that numbers aren't clear. That's something about the fact that the law is still relatively new. Now we're starting to learn what data we need to gather. And so what I'm going off of here is information from the US government. You might find the UN has some numbers, different organizations. So they might vary. You might have seen a few different things, but in general, top destination states, as it was mentioned, Florida number 3 in regards to the number of calls to the National Trafficking Hotline. I think it's also the number of investigations in the state. Top sites for domestic servitude were California, New York, and Maryland. However, we have had high-profile cases, so we do know that this is something that is happening in our state. The most common nationalities for domestic servitude: Filipino, Ethiopian, Indian, Guatemalan, and Mexican. That does not mean that American citizens might not be forced to work in a home as well. It's just that, once again, our focus to this point, with US citizens has been looking at the sex trafficking piece. We haven't looked as much at the labor piece, but I know that in some of the statements we heard earlier and so forth, we can't forget about labor. We can't forget to ask those questions. So I'm sure in the future we're going to put an emphasis also when we look at domestic trafficking, so trafficking of American citizens, also looking at labor, not just sex. And just so that you can, and I think this will help as you go through the different sessions, especially in services. When our law was passed in 2000, the system of care that was created for victims and what you'll hear is available for victims was mostly built around the fact of helping foreign survivors of trafficking. And the reason being is that the thought was that if you're an American citizen and trafficked within the United States, you're already going to be able to tap into services. There are already going to be services in place for you because you're a US citizen and you're within US borders. So most programs like mine first started to serve foreign victims. So we developed this whole network to help foreign survivors. What happened, so our data, everything we've done has been, you know, looking at labor, looking at agricultural trafficking and so forth. Everything has looked at foreign born victims. By 2005, the US government realized the number of American citizens trafficked within the US was larger than the number of people from other countries, and the system that existed was not appropriate. So then they allocated funding to serve those programs. The first programs were funded in 2009. So that piece still has to catch up to what we already had in place. We're trying to, that's why I said the government is now making sure that programs serve all victims, no longer picking and choosing, so that no matter if you're American or foreign born, you're able to receive the same services. But we're not there yet. So you will see that some of the data and some of the things that we talk about, there is a differentiation, and that's why, but we are trying to bring them to be equal. Any questions before I continue? Okay. So what we know, every year approximately 300,000, and this is on the high end, you might see 100,000 to 300,000 US citizen minors are trafficked within US border, primarily girls. In the US, 14,500 to 17,500 foreigners are trafficked into the country, 80% women and children. And at minimum, 90% of victims of domestic servitude are female. So that's why it could be, we haven't seen as many yet, but US girls as well as foreigners are very vulnerable to this particular type of victimization that we're going to speak about today. And as the governor pointed out, 27 million people are enslaved at any point around the world. And that's actually a larger number than when we think of the transatlantic slave trade in the past. Okay. What are the methods of recruitment? Fraud, trickery, false promises, familiarity. Something that's very interesting. A lot of times you find that, especially with familiarity, that the victim and the trafficker, and this is not just for domestic servitude, but for other types of trafficking, they tend to be from the same ethnic group, the same background. And the reason being, I always say, okay, I'm in a room with 100 people, and there are 99, let's say, men, and there's a woman. Or 99 people who don't look like me, and then that one person who does, or 99 people who don't speak my language, and that person who does. Who am I more likely to be drawn to? That person that I feel I share a bond with. And so what you see in a lot of these trafficking schemes is that people are from the same cultural background, and they will go ahead and trick or provide or coerce someone from their same background into a trafficking situation. So you will see, as we look at later, that the trafficker and the victim, well, I won't give it away because that will be one of the questions that I will ask you all, but you will see that a lot of times they share that bond. So why do victims fall prey to traffickers? Especially when we're looking at people coming from other countries, you do see political and economic instability. In their home countries, they cannot go ahead and their home countries cannot provide for those nationals or people from their own hometown, so they come to the United States. In the case of U.S. citizens, a lot of times it's abuse. As we heard from the survivor, there was abuse in the home, and so it causes a vulnerability that led to her meeting the trafficker and then being coerced into the situation. Certain social and cultural practices increase vulnerability to traffickers. So I'm going to introduce what we're going to look at a little bit later on, which is the restavek tradition. In Haiti, has anybody heard about restaveks in the past? Okay. So Haiti has this cultural tradition in which a child from a less affluent or an impoverished family will be given to a more affluent family member or individuals or relatives who could, in theory, provide a better home, a better life, education. And in exchange, the child will work in the home. What happens a lot of times is that the child is not allowed to go to school. The child does not lead a better life, and instead they become domestic servants. I had the opportunity this May to go to Haiti and help in their child response to trafficking, especially, or their response to child trafficking. And the main focus was the restavek tradition. And they would show us, for example, we drove around and we were able to see young children during, one of the things that's very interesting about the culture or society is children, when they go to school, all of them have uniforms. Very well dressed, no matter their economic or financial situation. The children are sent each day to school, with as many, the parents provide as many tools as possible for the children to receive the best education they can. And then you will see small children in more or less rags or very not as well kept as the other children, carrying pails of water, things like that. And they pointed out to us, those are restaveks. And the estimate by the U.S. State Department is about 500,000 children live in this condition. And what we're seeing now is because of Haiti's proximity to the United States, because also the earthquake, and because of the economic and political instability, there are Haitians here who are coming, and now we're finding restaveks in the United States. And we're going to look at one of those cases in a bit. Okay, so who are the traffickers? I went ahead and just the ones that are in bold are the ones that we see are more prevalent with domestic servitude. Caretakers, or those posing as caretakers. Diplomats. The Polaris Project talked about in the past 5 years or so, 5 to 7 years, there were 42 cases of trafficking, of domestic servitude done by diplomats from other countries. What happened is that the law, as it was originally written, diplomats, of course, have immunity. So they would be allowed to come into the country and bring their own staff. But in bringing their own staff, there weren't the same labor regulations that we have. And so there have been several trafficking scenarios. I don't know if anybody saw recently, there was also the Saudi Arabian princess who also had, I believe, a woman from Kenya who she was trafficking in her home. Now, the trafficking statute has been reauthorized or revised, if you want to say, a few times. 2003, 2005, 2008, 2010, I believe. And each time they strengthen our laws, strengthen the penalties, and one of those years, which can't remember which one, made sure that the State Department put stricter regulation on diplomats coming into the U.S. Okay, the members of the victim's own ethnic community, and the last one have significant social or political status in their home countries, and this one's important when we look at our case study. Okay. So some methods of control, and this is applicable to both domestic and international victims. There's the psychological abuse. That's why we talk about the fact of the restriction of movement. The person can freely leave. I worked in a domestic servitude case in which the psychological abuse was so big, and they would do things, for example, when the family would leave the home, they would put the alarm on in the house so that if the victim tried to leave, the alarm would go off and they would be notified. So psychologically, she would see them put it on, and it didn't matter. She didn't think about the fact, well, doesn't matter if it goes ahead and goes off. I mean, you're going to be able to run, out of the house and potentially contact someone. You're going to be free. But the abuse was so big and so prevalent that wasn't, that she wouldn't leave. Beatings, burnings, sexual abuse, and starvation. We're going to talk about in the labor panel later on in services. One of the things we'll talk about is there's this thought about the fact that sex trafficking and labor trafficking survivors have different needs. So the services are going to be different. But you see a lot of times in labor trafficking situations that there's also sexual abuse. It might not be commercial, so it might not be prostitution. Somebody might not be making money off of it, but there's still sexual abuse involved. So there's still similar trauma that you might see with a sex trafficking survivor. Isolation. This one with domestic servitude is very important because usually you have one domestic servant in the household. You don't tend to see, like, for example, in agricultural trafficking or sex trafficking, that they tend to be a larger number of victims. With domestic servitude, you tend to see much smaller numbers. For foreigners, threats of deportation, but this can also apply for domestic victims, not deportation. So it's not about like withholding the documents. It might not be the fact that they're going to take your immigration papers, but they'll take your birth certificate, they'll take your ID. You'll see that as well with American citizens. Threats against the victim's family members, and then drug and alcohol dependency, so to keep the victims working. Okay. Who are the victims? So we talked about undocumented immigrants. You have legal immigrants. You might see that a lot actually in domestic servitude. They come in with a visa. Sometimes it's not the appropriate visa. There are times that it is the visa to work in the U.S. Others are a tourist visa. But they might come with a legal form of documentation, not just, might not be undocumented. U.S. citizens. We're looking at men, women, and children. Well, you'll see in domestic servitude, women are prevalent, women and children are the larger groups that are more vulnerable to this type of victimization. You might also have some men. And what's important to note is that all victims have some form of vulnerability that the trafficker has pinpointed and used to exploit this person. Okay, so when we look at domestic servitude, and this is from the Polaris Project, what are their vulnerabilities? Because most victims of domestic servitude are foreigners, immigration status is huge. And as I mentioned, some workers do hold a visa, which is tied to their immigration status. So what happens is if they leave the situation, then they risk deportation. Once again, sometimes we think about, well, what if they're deported? At least they're going to be out of this situation. There was a case of an Egyptian girl. She was actually one of the first trafficking victims to get her U.S. citizenship. So there's a lot of information on her online. But she shares her story about the fact that she was from Egypt. The family who trafficked her was also Egyptian. And this was in California. And one of the things is that she had a chance to talk to her family back home and tell them about what was going on. And the family's response was, so what? You need to stay there. You're able to send some money back home to us. You're living in better conditions in the U.S., even though when you hear about the conditions she was living in California, they were deplorable, but according to her family, they were better to what she was living in Egypt, so you better stay. And so the family threatened that if she wanted to leave, her immigration status would be taken, and then she risked deportation back to the family who told her not to come back. So what was very interesting about this particular case is when she went ahead to swear in as a U.S. citizen, the people who were there present supporting her were her agent from Homeland Security, her social workers. Those had become her new family because those were the ones who rescued her from the situation, accepted her, and helped her move forward, took her from that situation. Okay. Traffickers may exert the control piece that we've mentioned. They also exploit the foreign national workers' unfamiliarity with the language, the laws, and the customs. A lot of times, what seems acceptable in one society, in one country, we know that it's not acceptable within the U.S. But how do they know? Also, and we've seen this with a lot of times with foreign victims, they were brought to the U.S., but when you ask them in a map, pinpoint where you are, where's the state of Florida, or where in the state of Florida are you, they have no idea because the traffickers are the ones who process their whole journey to the United States. So they don't know what's beyond the doors of where they're living. And so that also makes them scared and fearful of leaving. And as we talked about, there are things that they're not familiar with, overtime pay, knowing about what's a safe and healthy work environment, workplace discrimination, and so forth. Okay, so I'm going to need some volunteers. I have about 4 different slides. This story, let's talk about, okay. This story was taken from this is a case that was prosecuted in Miami. Actually, it happened in Miami, prosecuted in Broward County by the federal government. Happened around 2007 or so, and there was an article that came out detailing the story. They kind of have added, quoted, and have some interesting quotes and so forth, but the reason I included it is because it's just very interesting that it captures the community's perception of what happened and then the reality of what was happening inside this home, who's the trafficker. So I'm going to ask some questions as we go along. So we're going to look at a case of domestic servitude involving a restavek. As I mentioned, this is a cultural tradition in Haiti. These are children who are placed, as I mentioned, with families to lead a better life. They tend to be treated differently from non-biological children. and we'll see that in the story. And they are particularly vulnerable to beating, sexual assaults, and other abuses because they're not the same as the children in the household. They are a property. They are seen as someone who works for the family, despite the fact that this might be a child as young as 5 years of age. Okay, so this is the story in the Miami New Times. It's called Cinderella Story, and it was featured in August 2007. Okay, so who's going to read the first slide? Can I have a volunteer?
I'll read it.
Okay, yes, please.
First paragraph?
Just the slide. It's the story.
The whole slide.
The whole
Okay,
slide,
I wasn't
yes.
sure what you said, line or something.
Oh, I'm sorry, slide, yes.
I'll tell you one thing. She's a Christian woman. I'll tell you that, says the short, middle-aged Hispanic woman from her doorway, folding her arms across her chest and glancing at the pretty, well-kept house next door. Imagine the surprise then on April 4, 2007, when FBI agents showed up at a quiet house here and arrested Maud and her mother, Evelyn Theodore, at their home. Two others, Maud's sister, Claire Telasco, and St. Forth Paulin, Maud's ex-husband, were picked up elsewhere.
Okay, just to let you know, basically, I mean, I'm copying, the parts that I copied are straight from the story. There are some gaps because I just picked what was relevant to what we're going to do. So let's talk about, there's 3 things that stand out. Can someone name them? About, yes?
People have this predisposition that if people are Christian, they're good.
Okay.
Therefore, they're incapable of doing horrible things.
I think in the larger scope of things is the fact that not all traffickers are male, not all traffickers are, as we think about the pimp, the bad guy, right? I think a lot of times we have that image, and if we look at newspaper clippings, we've had U.S. soldiers, doctors, pastors, who've all been traffickers. And so I think that one of the reasons that's important is because as we look to raise awareness and as we look to identify more victims, you know, that we look beyond, you know, just the bad guy versus good guy. There are people who paint themselves to be good people and end up exploiting others. Thank you. Yes?
These situations are frequently hidden and the neighbors have no idea they're going on.
Oh, that's very good. I wasn't including that one, but that's a very good one. Thank you. Okay. Yes?
The socioeconomic component, a pretty well-kept house, goes against a lot of people's perceptions.
Exactly. This area of South Florida, Palmetto Bay, if anybody is familiar with it, is a middle to upper, middle high class area in South Florida. So it's definitely not an impoverished, which I think you hinted upon a little bit earlier. Yes, the socioeconomic piece. So thank you. Yes.
Everyone in the family was involved, like the sister, the husband.
Yeah. And that's the other part. It's about that it was a family. It was a family network. That it involved so many people, the mom, 2 sisters, and sister's husband. Good, thank you. Okay, who's my next volunteer? This is the slide? Okay, great.
The 4 are charged with various felonies for bringing Simone Celestine, a 14-year-old orphan, into the United States illegally to work as an unpaid domestic servant. According to the indictment, Simone was beaten with closed fists, forced to shower outside with a garden hose, rented to other homes, and not allowed to attend school. All 4 suspects have pleaded not guilty. The case goes to trial in October. If convicted, Maud Paulin and Evelyn Theodore could face up to 40 years in jail, the others slightly less. In 1999, a Pembroke Pines family was accused of beating, raping, and enslaving a 12-year-old girl brought from the island. Homeowner Billy Pompey Jr. fled to Haiti before trial.
There's a gap there, but the reason I included that piece is because they talked about that this is something that is more prevalent than we thought. There was another case in Pembroke Pines, another middle class to upper class community, Broward County, a little north of Miami. Same situation, also Haitian. Doesn't mean though all domestic servitude cases are from Haiti. Just this one in particular was highlighted. It was the mother. In this case, it was mother, husband, and son. So mother, father, and son. The son would sexually abuse the young girl, and he's the one that ended up fleeing to Haiti. But going back to that piece, the top piece, when we look at force, fraud, or coercion, where's the force, fraud, or coercion? She was beaten, closed fists.
Forced to shower outside.
Exactly. Where's the labor? Okay, not necessarily, because unpaid could be that, I mean, yes, I guess she was working, right? But rented to other homes.
Servant, but also she was rented out to other homes.
Exactly. So when we look at trafficking, we look at two things, right? The labor piece. She was unpaid domestic servant. She was rented, so they're making money off of this, right? And then the forced fraud or coercion. She's beaten, right? Not allowed to attend school, right?
Illegal. She's illegal, so like that's another thing.
To look into, you know. I mean, it could be that they brought someone in and, you know, there's labor exploitation there. But when we look at, usually it's the labor and the restriction of movement. Those are the two quick things that we always want to look at when we're looking at trafficking. Now, the reason I could face up to 40 years in jail is because the penalties in trafficking cases, when I heard about Stacey Harris, who was honored as our prosecutor of the year, that first sex trafficking case, life in prison. When I first started almost 10 years ago, the penalties would range from time served, 18 months, 3 years. So we're seeing an increase in the penalties for perpetrators, and that also helps survivors to see that what happened to them warranted that this person be punished for a certain period of time. Okay, who's the next volunteer? Come on, there's only a couple more. Yes, please.
In the case of the house on Southwest 87th Street, the only resident not charged is Maud's daughter, Erica, only 2 years older than Simone. If the allegations are true, it's something of a Cinderella story. A daughter who was well treated and a servant who was not. Maud Pollan, who is a teacher at Campbell Drive Middle School in Homestead. Sanford, Maud, and Maud's mother, Evelyn, busied themselves with affairs in Haiti, where they apparently oversaw the funding and management of the Diamede orphanage. It's located in Reiki, a mountain town of 25,000 people with no electricity, no phone service, and citizens who are among the poorest in the Western Hemisphere.
Thank you. So what was Simone's vulnerability? Where was she living? Where did they recruit her from? An orphanage, right? So here we have a young girl who's an orphan in Haiti, and they're giving her the opportunity of all the kids in the orphanage to be the one to come to the United States to live in this home. Now, what's interesting, what are the two things that are interesting about the traffickers here? And when we looked at who the traffickers are, there was one thing about them that is present here.
People with influence and power in their home country.
People with influence. And who was she here in the United States? She's a teacher, a middle school teacher. So this is a middle school teacher with a family who owns an orphanage, and they're bringing a young girl who's an orphan to live in their home and work in their home. And something else that, with the description a little bit about restaveks, that the children are not treated the same. And this was very important when there was actually an investigation. It was an FBI investigation eventually, was that when they looked at where Simone lived and where Erica lived and slept in the home, Erica had her own room. If I remember correctly, it was pink and frilly and girly, and Simone was sleeping in the garage. So you saw that the conditions, the girls were not living in the same, they were not treated the same. Okay, this one's shorter. Anybody? Yes, please.
14-year-old Simone was brought from the orphanage to the Pollan household that same year and told she was to go to the United States to live and work for defendant Maud Pollan. According to a complaint signed by U.S. Attorney Alexander Acosta and prosecutors Brent Tantillo and Edward Chung, the girl was then forced to work in both Maud's house and that of her sister, Claire Telesco. The sisters also charged people to have the teen work at their homes, the government alleges.
Thank you. So just to add to the story, so then what would happen is, so basically, just so that you know a little background, so Simone was forced to work in the home. She would iron clothes while the family went to sleep at night. They were all sleeping, resting. She would stay up, iron clothes, clean the kitchen, and so forth. And then on weekends, she would be given over to family friends and others, that they were familiar with to clean their homes. So they weren't only benefiting and, reaping from her work themselves, but then money from others. Okay, and this one's the last slide. Anybody wants to read it? Thank you.
When Simone didn't want to work, the women beat her with hands, closed fists, and other objects, the indictment claims. She was prohibited from using the phone, making friends, or leaving the house by herself. She had to remain in a closet or the garage when guests came. Nor was she enrolled in school. Defense attorney Joel DeFabio declined to comment further than to say the Pollins attempted to enroll Simone. At some point, she ran away and contacted authorities.
Okay, so the promise, right, to go ahead and live a better life and go to school was not kept, despite the fact that she was a teacher. So she would have the tools and the means to go ahead and be able to enroll her in school. Even though she ran away and contacted authorities, nothing came of that. Eventually, what happened was that Simone one of the family friends found that there was something to the situation. So friends of the Pollins found that there was something just very strange about this. And so she contacted an attorney who knew someone within the trafficking community or anti-trafficking community in South Florida. And they were able to take Simone from that situation and assist her and provide her services as a victim of human trafficking. But what's very interesting is about the fact of, with the Egyptian case that I talked about earlier, the young girl, she also had to remain in the closet, or also when guests came. The funny thing is that during one of the house parties, they were filming and the party itself, the celebration, and they see her in the background, and that was actually used against the family at time of trial, in the sense that she was there, she was cleaning, they could see her in the background, but usually kept hidden. Even though later on in this particular case, they talked about the Pollins, one of their arguments were, but she's like a daughter to us, yet she was supposed to remain in the closet and hidden from everybody. So any questions? Okay. Yes, please. So with trafficking specifically, when the law passed in 2000, one of the things that it created was a form of immigration relief, in the sense the creation of the T visa, that by coincidence is a trafficking visa. So one thing that it allows is programs to provide, so there are programs that provide services, and one of the things that we do as a social service provider is we refer to immigration attorneys who provide the service for free and represent the client as they go through the process. The T visa allows the victim to stay in the country, receive a work authorization and social security number. After 3 years, they can become they can adjust to become a U.S. resident and eventually a citizen. Because the law has been still relatively new, we're starting to now see the first group, like I mentioned about that young girl who've become a U.S. citizen. But yes, and one of the things is that, for example, Simone, if she had parents or siblings in her home country under the T visa, they would be allowed to also come into the United States. Yes. Yes, please.
You had mentioned that she ran away and contacted authorities and nothing came of it.
I don't remember all the specific details, to be honest with you, but I do know that eventually when she was rescued was due to the family friend, not to her contact with authorities. Yeah, sorry.
How often do we see people being deported instead of getting the T visa?
I don't know about specific numbers of those who are deported. It's very interesting because Homeland Security has a double mandate, in the sense they can provide, they do deportation pieces, but they also can provide trafficking survivors with what's called continued presence, which is immigration relief that allows them to stay right away, because the T visa, the whole process can be 6 months to a year. So that means 6 months to a year that they are not able to work, not able to access, let's say, public benefits or health care. So what I can say, and while I don't have the numbers, I can say that Homeland Security, especially their human trafficking and smuggling units, has done a great job of understanding that victims, yes, they might have come here illegally. However, if they are victimized and they're a victim of trafficking, they are entitled to relief. So it's kind of like, for example, if someone who was smuggled in or someone who crossed our borders illegally, that's kind of forgiven. And then they're seen as a trafficking victim and they can move forward and they process their paperwork. So I don't know if anybody, and I welcome if anybody has the answer to that, I'd love to hear it. But I think we haven't.
I'm from Homeland Security.
Please.
And I would agree with that. We're
Yeah.
very, very sensitive to trafficking victims.
Yeah.
And if not a continued presence, there's also deferred action
Mhm.
or special parole.
And what area are you, what geographic area are you from? In Tampa. So anybody, yours there? Okay. We had, yes, the gentleman here, I'm sorry, he's been
Well,
waiting.
I think you mentioned that like in the Egyptian case, the
Mhm.
family knows
Yeah.
that she's being mistreated
Mhm.
here. She's
Yeah.
here with their blessing.
Yes.
But she's still allowed to bring her family over, even though they were basically part of the ring?
And they might
Like
not.
that?
And that's the thing. There are different forms of visas. For example, there's the special immigrant juvenile visa, which allows a child within a year to become a resident. It cuts off the family. It does not allow the family to come into the country. So that would be something that we work in multidisciplinary teams. So there's the service provider, there's law enforcement, there's the immigration attorney, and we look at working with the victim, because it's a victim-centered approach, at what's best. So that might not be the best option. And in her case, the family did not come. Is it a possibility? Yes, but for example, when you file a visa, you have to, it's a thick process. You have to explain all of that and all of that background. So they might not be granted a visa themselves. So, but yes, there is those things that need to be taken into consideration into it. Please.
How difficult are these cases to try as opposed to a sex trafficking case?
Yeah, I mean, here you have a couple of things. You have the fact that sometimes it's a single victim versus, and I think it has to do with sometimes not just how difficult, it's capacity of an agency. It's proving, right, some of these things from happening, that have happened, and also from the prosecution end. I've heard state attorney's offices say, you know what, it's easier for me to prove or to prosecute sexual battery than it is a case like this. Because it happened inside a home, because it's he said, she said kind of situation. How do you prove a lot of these things? And that's what makes it very difficult. So, I think I saw another hand.
And I can imagine some other reasons that may bring this to law enforcement attention, like maybe domestic battery or petty theft or something like that, you know, especially with children. And then in those cases, you know, I wonder how much investigation is done, and you know, a lot of these kids being victims of trafficking, do they get charged with criminal offenses, and then the trafficking, you know, gets not noticed?
Yeah. No, and it's for example, we're working on a case right now that the victim is a victim of domestic servitude. Well, the trafficker has gone ahead and filed, I guess, a complaint against her for stealing. So then now she is working on a human trafficking case with law enforcement, but then there's a side case. And in here now she's being seen as the defendant or the perpetrator and so forth. So that's why it's very difficult. And of course he has his family who all lived with her supporting her statement, and it's her statement against his. So it's very difficult. Yes?
For survivors of all of this,
Yeah.
are there particular organizations that network them for support?
Yes, and what I encourage you, there's some great resource tables, and actually I think I have, that kind of segues me into the next part, so. Okay. So, and I'll answer that as I come to this. Any other questions about the case study before we move into, so what do we do if we find a survivor of domestic servitude? Okay, so, oh yes, please.
I don't have your answer, but one of the things I saw there were troubled in our county, it's probably statewide, but the defendants, the opponents said, we tried to enroll her in school. And in our county, we can't get our kids into school unless there has been almost a judge's determination that this person is the adult custodian of the child. And we're getting a lot of kids not getting into school fast enough as the school year started out because they didn't have proper certification
Exactly.
The adult responsible was entitled to enroll them.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking to myself, we're going to see a lot of kids not going to school if we
Exactly.
keep clamping down
Yeah.
on this situation.
Yeah, and that's why it's piecing, right, all these things together. It's sometimes not just, I mean, for us, always the red flags as we do an assessment, like I said, it's the labor and the restriction of movement, right? So that makes it trafficking. But as you're building your case, or you're also doing the assessment, it's all those different components. Okay, the enrollment of the school. The enrollment of that piece, the enrollment of the school might by itself not be, you know, it's not automatically a trafficking case, but it's something that you keep in the back of your mind of, okay, is this something, yes, systemic problem that there's just in the county in regards to, or is this particular to this situation? As I said, this was a school teacher. So in theory, we would think that she would have the tools or know-how on how to do it, but definitely. So talking about victims, and actually as we talked about a little bit about the services and so forth, they're entitled to safety, privacy, immigration relief, as it was asked, restitution. This is something that's still, when people talk about what can we advocate for in changing laws, restitution is one of them. Unfortunately, you find, especially in larger cases or cases involving gangs or organized crime, where they made so much money, the victim in the end, we had one case, and I believe that the award was, if I remember correctly, it was about 1.5 million. There were several victims involved. If you talk to the victims so many years later, they've only gotten hundreds, I think at most $1,000 and it's just to compensate for the work that they did. It's not, they're asking just for what they're owed. Civil compensation. The two that I want to point out are return home and family reunification. Not all victims want to stay, if it's an American citizen, let's say they were trafficked in Florida, they might want to go back to their home state. And if they're from another country, just last month, we had someone who returned home. A lot of times the U.S. is not what they expected it to be. And no matter that now we're here to step in and help them and provide a better show them, right, a better path or a better life, it might not be what they want. It might not be the place they want to stay. So what we do is we help in repatriating them, not deporting them, because what happens with deportation is they will not be able to come back for a period of 10 years. In the case of repatriation, they would be able to come back to the United States, of course, within legal means, whenever they choose, and they're put in contact with a social service agency in their home country to help them as a survivor of trafficking. And then on the flip side, family reunification for those who want to stay. As I mentioned in Simone's case, she could have brought her family in. In the case of an adult, they can bring in their children and spouse to the United States. Any questions? Okay. So some of the services, so there are federally funded programs, and I will show you two maps afterwards so you have a little bit of an idea, but they're federally funded programs like mine throughout the United States. So what I encourage you to do is to go visit. I believe we have World Relief is one of them, so if you're from the Tampa Bay region, you also have an office in Jacksonville, correct?
Yes, we're
Okay. So if you're in Jacksonville, if you're in the Tampa area, you have a federally funded agency with two different sites who, what we're mandated to do, I'm in the Miami Southeast area, is to provide assistance. So while there's an investigation that's taking place and there's a prosecution, we provide the support services. We provide housing, medical care, mental health. While we might not provide it directly, we can refer. We have funding when there are things such as medical care that might not be able to be given pro bono, but at a sliding fee, we can provide and pay for that. Dental care, literacy, job training, and education can help with employment. And the reason we exist is that there are, sometimes with trafficking cases, a survivor might need assistance for a year or so. The investigation might take a long time. And so a lot of times agencies don't have the money to be able to provide those services, those support services for that period of time, and that's what we're mandated to do. So we're here to assist while everything else is happening in the meantime. Okay. Interpreter and translation services, legal immigration, we fund those services. Legal assistance in the case of what if the domestic servant ends up sexually abused by one of the men, in the case, let's say the Pembroke Pines case, right? The William Pompey, the son abused the young girl. What if she ended up pregnant and had a child? Now we're dealing with family court issues. There's a child, there's the victim, there's the perpetrator, they have a child in common, so they might need legal assistance in that department. Transportation, your law enforcement, you're going to be interviewing the survivor, you need her to get to your office. Transportation assistance. Life skills. You have a child who's 12 years old, who was not going to school, who maybe now needs help. She's 18, needs help in those life skills. How do you balance a checkbook? How do you ride local transportation? All those different things. And in our case, we provide a 24-hour evening and weekend response to law enforcement, the community, and the victim themselves if they need us. There are also public benefits available to survivors, including Medicaid, SNAP, which is food stamps, and there are some specific employment programs to help them under refugee services. So this would be under the department. All of these would be under the Department of Children and Families. So if you see your local Department of Children and Families counterpart, feel free to reach out to them so they can tell you a little bit more about this if you're working with survivors. This is specifically, the latter part is specifically for foreign survivors, but domestic survivors would also be able to receive Medicaid and the food stamps. So some of the trafficking programs, there are two funding sources. This is just a map of, it doesn't tell you the agencies, but just who the funders are. But all 50 states have providers. This is who used to be our task forces. But there is a response in those areas. Jacksonville, per se, didn't have a federally funded task force, but they do have a provider in the area as well. So it's not as up to date as I like to be, but I just wanted to show there are providers throughout the whole country. Okay. So do we have any questions as we wrap up? We have a few minutes. I don't know if any of you filled out your questionnaire, the little question card you had, or if you'd like to just raise your hand and ask anything. Yes, please, in the back. Oh, I'm sorry. Just.
Go ahead. You mentioned about Department of Children and Families.
Yes.
And that's part of what I do, is that when a child has an open span in our family network, called FISBIN,
yes.
That's how they get staff to child welfare and paid mental health plan.
Yeah.
Do the children that are trafficked,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we have some trafficking kids in foster care and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But normally, do they transition over to DCF and then have an open span?
They would transition to DCF. One thing that for foreign minors, there's a federally funded foster care system. There's 22 sites around the country, and we happen to have one in South Florida. So what I think the department would do, it's called the Unaccompanied Refugee Minors Program. And so what would be done in that particular case of someone like Simone is that they would see what is the better fit long-term for her. So for example, URM, a minor can stay in the program until the age of 23, as long as they're working or studying, so that they have that piece from 18 to 23 that they're receiving assistance. But yes, that was part of what the creation of the maltreatment code in 2009 is, so that you didn't have to fit it into the existing maltreatments of abandonment, abuse, or neglect. Now there's child trafficking. So you can call the department, and the department will staff it and see what is best for the needs of the child. Yes, please.
You mentioned that there's federal funding, and from the map it looks like there's also private funding.
It should have all been federal. Okay. This is Department of Justice and Department of Health and Human Services.
In my victimology class, we had just learned about, I could be quoting it wrong, the Son of Sam statute, where people who have victimized other people, they're prohibited from making money off, say, writing a book or appearances. Is there anything like that maybe down the line that might be considered for the people who were the perpetrators to actually put into the system that funds helping the victims?
Oh, I don't know about that. I don't know any of our, maybe Jennifer, who's also. Yeah.
Son of Sam's, but I mean, in Florida at least, attempts being made through the safe harbor legislation to assess fines that would then support victim survivors.
Exactly. So for soliciting, so before soliciting prostitution, I believe the fine was $500, and now it's up to $5,000 with $4,500. Yeah.
It's on the books.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
In order to sell your story, you gotta have notoriety, and these people are doing everything they can to be under the radar. So Son of Sam, because of what he did,
Mm-hmm.
and it became such a national news story, and serial killers and people like that can get that level of infamy, but these folks are under the radar.
Well, but you might see it maybe with, not so much with domestic servitude, but maybe like the pimps, right? That pimp subculture of that glamorizes having the girls and things like that. Maybe around that particular type of grouping. But I do agree that there's others who want to make sure that they keep it that under the radar. Yes?
On the flip side of that, there are some former criminals and traffickers that have had life-changing experiences and are now helping this issue. So we have to look at both sides of anything.
Mm-hmm.
Are we going to restrict people, or are we going to allow them to help?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
by writing stories is what I'm trying to say.
Yes, please.
I don't think this is going to help.
So we see we have a little debate going on here.
In drug prosecution, there's forfeiture.
Yeah.
Where they seize the home, or the vehicles, the boats, whatever. I'm wondering, do we have enough going to the victims in terms of compensation for their future? And if not, I think we really should start legislative reform to put forfeiture.
Yeah.
I mean, that nice home, the kid ought to get it.
Yeah. I believe forfeiture is one of the, it's the enforcement. Yeah,
Does
exactly.
it go to the state, though, or is it going back to the victims?
Maybe it
The
is
hard part is getting it directly back to
to the victims.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so last question
So
or comment.
I'm curious, is the conviction of the perpetrator a necessity, or if you have somebody who escapes and seeks services, but then there isn't a successful criminal case,
Yeah.
then what?
No, and the reality of it is, while even cooperation with law enforcement is strongly encouraged, the T visa, for example, is something, it's a self-petitioning visa. So you do have cases, for example, that the victim might not want to cooperate because the trafficker is the family member, the parent, or so forth. And there are situations in which they can prove or support the fact that there are these circumstances, and they are granted assistance, and they are granted immigration relief, and so forth. There are cases that there's full cooperation, but there's not enough for a prosecution. So the U.S. government might choose, whether at the state or federal level, not to prosecute. That doesn't impede the assistance given to the survivor of trafficking.
Just get clear, though, if that's a foreign-born child who's the victim, or anybody in labor, actually, who's trafficked, we do have to have a certification from, usually, like the federal attorney's office or something. If they need a visa, the T visa, they have to have a certification signed. At least we've been stopped without the certification.
Yeah, the Vermont Service Center, who's the one that processes the T visas, might come back with a request for either more evidence or more information. That's why, as long as it's very well supported, very well documented, it's not the norm, but it definitely has happened. We've had several cases that, because of the situation and the circumstances, they're granted the visa despite the lack of cooperation. Yeah, doesn't always happen, but it can. And then throughout the last few years, it's getting harder. You have to have more, because the government is encouraging that multidisciplinary model of working together. So there shouldn't be a reason why someone might not want to cooperate, or why there isn't that piece. But before, especially when law enforcement works separately from service providers, we tended to each work in our own individual silos. We saw more of those types of cases. So maybe what you're seeing now, it's more of the recent norm, but it's happened. Yes. Yes, please, go ahead.
No one has a question, I don't want to hog it, but
No.
this question of force, when you have these people who are in debt, and they are working off their debt, it gets really hard to figure out what's the level of force, coercion involved, and how much of it is because they contracted to do this in order to pay off their debt.
Well, we can look at
I'd like
it.
you to talk about, if you give me a bright line, that'd be great.
Well, we can look at it, for example, in smuggling. With smuggling and trafficking, right? When we look at differentiation between the two. With smuggling, someone crosses the border, they have let's say they still have a debt, they come to an agreement with the trafficker on the terms of how much is going to be paid or by when it's going to be paid or so forth. But the person is free to work wherever it is that they want to work. With trafficking, it's the fact that the person crosses the border and then they're not allowed to leave the situation. They have to work for that person wherever that person deems, and they don't know when they're going to be. They're in bondage. So I think that that's part of it. It's the fact of, it's one thing that you have a debt and you're going to pay it off, but no questions asked on how you do it. And then there's the other one that you are forced to pay it off under these conditions. That's the closest that I can think of in comparison.
Another tell is how much? Is that a reasonable fair market value? Is it 50 times exorbitant? Exactly.
Yeah. So, well, I welcome if anybody has any questions. I'll be here for a few minutes. We've gone over by a few, so please feel free to, if you're in the South Florida area or want to see what one of the programs can provide, I have some information up there. There's also my contact information. Thank you so much for your cooperation, for reading the slides and your questions. So thank you so much. Enjoy the summit.